The night the storm returned, a retired Navy SEAL who had already buried too many ghosts heard a faint scratching at his cabin door. He thought it was the wind until a trembling shadow stood there, heavy with life, waiting. Years after Iraq had taken everything from him, something unexpected had come back through the snow. The first snow did not fall gently over the mountains of Colorado that year. It came like a quiet warning, settling across the ridges, the frozen lake below, and the scattered cabins that clung to the slopes as if they had something left to prove. The air carried that sharp, metallic cold that pressed into the lungs and lingered there, and above the tree line, the sky stretched pale and indifferent, as though winter had already decided how the season would end. Thomas Hale lived alone at the edge of that silence, in a weathered wooden cabin built decades earlier by hands that had known patience better than grief.
Come on, in you go.
The cabin leaned slightly to one side, its porch worn smooth by years of wind and neglect, its roof patched in places that told quiet stories of storms survived rather than victories won. Tom had chosen this place not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it asked nothing of him. At 52, Thomas Hale was a man whose presence carried weight even when he stood still. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his frame still disciplined by years of military training that had never fully left his muscles, his movements economical, precise, as if every action still required purpose. His hair, once dark, had faded into a rough mix of iron gray, cut short out of habit rather than care, and his face bore the kind of hard angles that time did not soften but sharpened. A faint scar traced along his jawline, nearly hidden beneath a day's growth of beard, and his eyes, a cold blue that rarely settled on anything for long, carried the distant look of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. Iraq had not broken him in the way people expected war to break a man. It had hollowed him out instead, leaving behind a version of himself that could still function, still breathe, still move through the world, but no longer belonged to it. He had returned years ago with medals he never displayed, with memories he never spoke of, and with a silence that had eventually cost him his marriage. His wife, Emily Hale, had once been a warm presence in his life, a woman with soft brown hair and a patience that had tried, for years, to reach him through the distance he carried inside himself. But there are distances no one can cross alone, and when she finally left, she did so quietly, taking only what she needed and leaving behind a house that had already begun to feel empty long before she walked out the door. Tom had not followed. Instead, he had come here, to the mountains, to a place where silence did not feel like failure. His days moved in simple patterns now, built from routine rather than intention. He woke when the light shifted against the cabin walls, fed the small iron stove with split wood, and stood on the porch with a chipped mug of black coffee that tasted more like habit than comfort. He checked the roof when snow began to gather, reinforced the door when the wind turned sharp, and walked the short path to the edge of the trees where the land dropped away toward the frozen lake below. He spoke rarely, even to himself, and when he did, his voice carried the roughness of disuse. The town of Pine Ridge lay a few miles down the mountain, a scattering of buildings that seemed to huddle together against the cold. And though Tom rarely went there, the town had not forgotten him. People noticed things in places like this. They noticed who stayed, who left, and who never quite seemed to arrive at all. Clara Reed had arrived the previous spring, and even now, months later, no one in Pine Ridge could say with certainty how old she was. She carried herself with a quiet steadiness that made age seem irrelevant, her figure slender but strong, her posture straight in a way that suggested both resilience and restraint. Her hair, a deep chestnut that caught hints of copper in the light, was usually tied back loosely at the nape of her neck, though strands often escaped to frame a face that was neither young nor old, but marked by a kind of calm that came from having endured something without needing to explain it. Her eyes were warm brown, observant without being intrusive, and there was a softness in the way she spoke to people that did not invite questions, but answered them anyway. She owned the small bakery on Main Street now, a narrow place that smelled of bread and cinnamon even on the coldest mornings, and though she worked alone, she never seemed lonely. Some said she had lost her husband years ago, somewhere far from Colorado, in a way she never described. Others said she had simply chosen to leave a life behind. Clara never corrected anyone. She let the town believe what it needed to believe, and in return the town accepted her without pressing further. Lucas Bennett was 12 years old and had the kind of quiet that made adults lower their voices without knowing why. He was thin, all elbows and long limbs, with dark hair that never quite stayed in place beneath the knit cap he wore even when it wasn't cold enough to require it. His eyes, a steady gray, held a depth of observation unusual for someone his age, as if he had learned early that watching was safer than speaking. Lucas lived with his mother in a small house near the edge of town, and though she worked long hours at the grocery store, he rarely complained. He spent most afternoons wandering the outskirts of Pine Ridge, following trails that led toward the mountain, toward the trees, toward the quiet places where the world seemed easier to understand. He had seen Tom Hale more than once, always from a distance, always standing still, as if the man might disappear if approached too closely. There was something about Tom that Lucas recognized, though he could not have explained it, something in the way he stood alone without looking lost. That morning, as the first real snow of the season settled deeper into the ground, Lucas paused at the edge of the tree line and looked up toward the cabin. Smoke rose in a thin line from the chimney, dissolving into the pale sky, and for a moment he wondered what it would be like to live in a place where no one expected anything from you. Then he turned back toward town, leaving only his footprints behind. Tom did not notice the boy that day. He spent the afternoon repairing a loose board along the side of the cabin, his hands moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who trusted work more than thought. The cold had begun to deepen by then, the kind that settled into the bones and refused to leave, and as evening approached, the wind shifted, carrying with it the promise of something heavier than snow. He felt it before he saw it, the way the air changed, the way the trees seemed to lean into the coming storm. By the time darkness settled over the mountain, the snow had begun again, thicker now, driven by a steady wind that pressed against the cabin walls and whispered through the cracks in the wood. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows across the floor, and Tom sat in his chair near the stove, staring at nothing in particular, his thoughts moving in slow, familiar patterns that never quite reached a conclusion. There were nights when the past came back louder, nights when the silence inside his head broke open into fragments of memory, heat, dust, voices shouting across distances that could not be crossed. But this was not one of those nights. This night was quieter, heavier, as if something beyond the storm was waiting just out of sight. The sound came so faintly at first that he almost dismissed it as part of the wind. A light scraping, irregular, soft enough to be mistaken for branches brushing against the door. Tom did not move immediately. He had learned, over the years, to ignore what did not demand attention. But the sound came again, slightly stronger this time, carrying with it a rhythm that did not belong to the storm. His head lifted, just slightly, his body still otherwise, listening. The fire crackled behind him. The wind pressed harder against the walls, and there it was again, scratch, pause, scratch. Not the frantic clawing of an animal in panic, not the random strike of debris against wood, but something slower, deliberate, as if whatever stood outside the door had already used up most of its strength just getting there. Tom stood, the movement quiet but decisive, his senses sharpening in a way that had never fully left him, even after all these years. He crossed the small space of the cabin in a few measured steps, stopping just short of the door. For a moment, he simply stood there, his hand hovering near the handle, his breath steady, his mind empty of everything except the present. The scratching came once more, softer now, almost fading. Outside, the storm continued its steady assault, covering the world in white, erasing tracks, swallowing sound. Inside, Thomas Hale, a man who no longer believed in being needed, found himself listening to something that refused to be ignored. He did not open the door. Not yet. But he did not walk away either. And in that narrow space between action and hesitation, something inside him shifted, so small it might have gone unnoticed, but real enough to matter. The storm had grown heavier by the time Thomas Hale finally made the decision to move, the wind pressing harder against the cabin walls, as if it had been waiting for him to hesitate, waiting to see whether he would remain the man who turned away or become something else entirely. The scratching came again, weaker now, uneven, as though whatever stood on the other side of the door was slipping closer to the edge of its strength with each passing second, and Tom felt something shift inside his chest, not sharp enough to be called pain, not soft enough to be ignored, just a quiet insistence that standing still was no longer an option. He reached for the handle, his hand rough and steady despite the cold that had crept into his fingers, and for a brief moment he paused again, listening, measuring, the old instincts of caution rising without being invited, but this time they did not stop him. When the door opened, the storm came in first, a rush of frozen air and swirling snow that cut across the room like something alive, forcing Tom to lean slightly into it just to hold his ground, and for a second he saw nothing but white and motion and the violent blur of winter at its worst. Then the shape emerged. She stood just beyond the threshold, barely visible through the snow that clung to her fur and filled the air around her. A German shepherd, large even in her weakened state, her coat a dark sable mixed with black and tan that would have been striking under different circumstances, now dulled and matted by ice and exhaustion. Her body was low, her legs trembling with the effort of remaining upright, and her belly, swollen and heavy, made it immediately clear what had driven her this far into the storm. She was close to giving birth, perhaps hours away, perhaps less, and every line of her posture carried the strain of it. But it was her eyes that held him. They were not wild, not aggressive, not even fearful in the way most animals became when pushed beyond their limits. They were steady, fixed on him with a kind of fragile determination, as if she had already decided that this place, this man, was her last chance, and she would not waste the little strength she had left on anything unnecessary. She did not bark. She did not growl. She only stood there, breathing in short, shallow bursts, her sides rising and falling too quickly, her breath visible in the cold air like something that might disappear at any moment. Tom did not speak. Words would have felt wrong here, too heavy for the simplicity of what was happening. He had seen desperation before, in men who had run out of options, in moments where survival came down to the smallest choices, and there was something unmistakably familiar in the way this animal held herself, not pleading, not surrendering, but enduring, just long enough to reach the next step. Snow gathered at her paws, already beginning to cover the faint tracks that led up to the porch, as if the storm itself was trying to erase the path that had brought her here. And Tom found himself glancing down at those tracks, then back at her, measuring the distance she must have traveled, the time it must have taken, the number of times she could have stopped and simply laid down instead of continuing. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought surfaced, quiet and unwelcome. Most creatures would not have made it this far. He stepped slightly to the side, not fully committing. Not yet, but enough to change the space between them, enough to signal that the barrier of the doorway was no longer absolute. The dog did not move immediately. She seemed to hesitate, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion, as if even the act of deciding required more energy than she could easily give, and for a moment, Tom wondered if she would collapse right there on the threshold. Then, slowly, she shifted her weight forward. One step. It was unsteady, her front paw sliding slightly on the wooden porch before finding purchase, and her body swayed with the effort. But she did not fall. Another step followed, smaller, more cautious, her head lowering slightly as she crossed into the space just inside the doorway, and with it came the full weight of the storm clinging to her fur, melting in small droplets that darkened the cabin floor. The air changed as the door remained open, the warmth from the stove struggling against the cold that pushed inward, and Tom felt the familiar urge to shut it out, to restore the balance he understood, but he held it there a moment longer, watching as the dog moved fully inside. Her legs buckled once, briefly, her body dipping before she caught herself, and the sound that escaped her then was soft, almost lost beneath the wind. Not a whine, not quite a cry, but something closer to the involuntary release of tension that comes when survival has carried a creature further than it expected to go. Only then did Tom close the door. The latch clicked into place with a finality that felt larger than the simple action, sealing the cabin against the storm once more, and for a moment the room fell into a different kind of silence, one that was no longer empty. The dog stood there, just inside the entrance, her breathing still rapid, her body trembling in waves that traveled from her shoulders down to her hind legs. And as Tom turned to face her fully, he noticed the smaller details that the storm had hidden at first glance. There were faint scars along her side, old enough that the fur had grown back unevenly over them, and a thin line near her ear where the hair had not returned at all, suggesting a past that had not been kind. Her collar was missing, the fur around her neck slightly worn in a way that hinted she had worn one before, and the absence of it now spoke of separation, of escape, or of loss. She lowered herself carefully to the floor, not collapsing, but easing down with deliberate control, as if even in her weakened state she refused to surrender completely to it. Her head lifted again, her eyes finding Tom once more, and in that gaze there was something that settled into the space between them, something unspoken but undeniable. He moved slowly, his steps measured, giving her time to react, to decide whether his presence was a threat or something else. And when he reached the small table near the stove, he paused, his hand resting briefly against the worn wood as he considered what came next. He had not planned for this. His life had been constructed carefully around the absence of need, around the idea that nothing would arrive uninvited, and yet here she was, a living interruption to that carefully maintained distance. In town, Clara Reed stood near the front window of her bakery, her hands resting lightly against the counter, as she looked out at the snow that had begun to thicken into a steady curtain of white. The evening had driven most people indoors, but something about the pattern of the storm, the way the wind shifted and settled, drew her attention beyond the usual concerns of closing up for the night. She noticed the tracks first when she stepped outside to secure the sign, faint at the edge of the street where the snow had not yet fully covered them. Large prints, spaced unevenly, leading away from town and up toward the mountain. She crouched slightly, her gloved fingers brushing lightly against one of the impressions, feeling the depth of it, the way the edges had begun to soften under the falling snow, and though she could not have said why, a quiet unease settled in her chest. It was not fear, not exactly, but a recognition that something had passed through this place with purpose, something that had not turned back. She straightened, her gaze following the direction of the tracks until they disappeared into the whitening distance, and for a moment she remained there, as if listening to something beyond the wind. Lucas Bennett saw the same tracks earlier that afternoon, before the storm had grown strong enough to erase them. He had been near the edge of the woods, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground, when he noticed the pattern cutting across the path, larger than the usual stray dogs that sometimes had been wandered near the outskirts of town. He had crouched then, studying them with the careful attention he gave to things that did not immediately explain themselves, and something about the spacing, the slight drag in one of the hind prints, suggested fatigue or injury, or both. He followed them for a short distance, just enough to confirm that they led upward, toward the cabins scattered along the ridge, and then he stopped, not out of fear, but out of an instinct he did not fully understand, the sense that this path belonged to something that did not need to be interrupted. Back in the cabin, Tom stood watching the dog as she settled near the warmth of the stove, her breathing beginning to slow, though the tension in her body had not fully eased. He noticed the way her abdomen tightened briefly, a subtle contraction that passed as quickly as it came, and the realization settled in with quiet clarity. She had not come here by chance. She had come here because she needed a place to bring new life into the world, and for reasons he could not explain, she had chosen him. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the low crackle of the fire, and then, without speaking, without making it into something larger than it needed to be, he stepped back, creating space, opening the room in a way that had nothing to do with the physical boundaries of the cabin. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant in its simplicity, but it was enough. The dog lifted her head slightly, watching him, and then, with a final shift of her weight, she closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as if accepting what had already been decided. Outside, the storm continued to fall, covering the mountain in white, erasing the path that had led her here. But inside, for the first time in a long while, Thomas Hale was no longer alone, and he understood, even if he did not yet fully accept it, that this moment, this quiet decision to step aside and let something in, would change everything that followed. The night deepened around the cabin until the storm outside no longer sounded like weather, but like an old animal circling in the dark, testing the walls, searching for one weak place it could enter, and inside that narrow wooden shelter, Thomas Hale stood beside the stove with the strange, unsettling awareness that the world had just placed something fragile in his hands and was waiting to see what he would do with it. The shepherd lay on the old wool blanket he had dragged close to the heat, her body curled as carefully as her swollen belly allowed, her breath still uneven, her sides tightening now in a rhythm that Tom recognized not from experience, but from instinct, from the unmistakable pattern of a body beginning the hard work it had traveled so far to do. She was quieter than he expected. No whining, no frantic movements, only a low tension that ran through her like a hidden current, and every few minutes her muscles drew taut, her head lifted slightly, and her amber eyes searched the room as if confirming that the walls still stood, that the fire still burned, that the man who had let her in had not vanished. Tom moved with the focused caution he had once used while kneeling over wounded men in places where the air smelled of blood, diesel, and dust instead of smoke and snow. The memory made his stomach tighten. There had been nights in Iraq when a man's life depended on whether Tom's hands shook, and his hands had never shaken then. They had been certain, hard, obedient to training, steady even while mortar fire thudded in the distance or radio static hissed broken orders into his ear. But tonight, under the soft light of a cabin lamp, beside a laboring dog whose trust felt more intimate than anything he had been offered in years, he noticed the faint tremor in his fingers and hated it. He filled a basin with warm water, laid out clean towels from the cupboard, and knelt on the floor beside her, feeling strangely clumsy, as if all the things that once made him competent in chaos had no language for this gentler kind of emergency. The dog turned her head toward him during the next contraction, and though pain had sharpened the lines around her muzzle, she did not bare her teeth or shrink from his presence. She only watched him with exhausted concentration, as though she had already made her judgment. "All right," Tom murmured, his voice rough from disuse and from something else he refused to name. "You came this far, we'll finish it." The first pup arrived less than an hour later, sliding into the world in a blur of wet fur and trembling newness that seemed too small to belong to such a violent night. Tom froze for half a heartbeat, struck by the absurd tenderness of it, then reached in with careful hands, following what little he remembered from scattered childhood farm visits and whatever mercy instinct could still offer. The mother licked at the tiny body as soon as he placed it near her, her movements immediate despite exhaustion, the ancient intelligence of motherhood taking over where fear ended. The pup was dark-backed like her, slick and fragile. Its first thin cry so small, Tom almost missed it beneath the wind. A second followed after more time, this one lighter at the paws, stronger in its first squirming struggle, and then a third. The cabin, which had known only silence and restraint for so long, had begun to fill with sounds too soft for war and too sacred for loneliness. The mother's low breathing, the minute squeaks of blind newborns, the hiss of snow against the window, the occasional rise and fall of Tom's own unsteady breath. Somewhere between the second and third pup, he realized he was speaking to her without thinking, not saying anything useful, just the kind of half-murmured reassurance people offer babies, horses, the dying, and the frightened, as if tone itself can become shelter. In town, Clara Reed stood in the dim back room of her bakery, wrapping a loaf of soft country bread and 2 still warm cinnamon rolls in brown paper while the wind rattled the window panes. She had closed early because of the storm, but she had not gone home right away. Something about those tracks from earlier remained with her, not as fear, but as a persistent tug at her attention. Clara was the sort of woman who never dramatized instinct, yet she had learned to respect it. Widowhood had trained that in her. Years ago, after one winter had taken her husband on a black ice road and returned only silence in his place, she had become less trusting of ordinary assumptions. Life could split open over something as small as a missed turn, a patch of hidden ice, an unanswered phone call. Since then, she had grown into a woman of composed habits and quiet acts, not sentimental, not cold, simply unwilling to ignore what her spirit noticed before her mind could explain it. She pulled on her dark green coat, wrapped a thick scarf once around her throat, and decided she would drive partway up the ridge in the morning if the roads allowed it. She did not yet know why. She only knew that sometimes care arrived before invitation. At nearly the same hour, Lucas Bennett sat by the window in the cramped house he shared with his mother, his homework forgotten in his lap as he watched the storm erase the road beyond their porch. His mother, Dana Bennett, moved quietly in the kitchen, tired from a double shift at the grocery store and too practical to waste energy on complaints. Dana was a compact woman in her late 30s, with tired hazel eyes, a capable mouth, and dark blonde hair she wore in a loose knot that always seemed one pin away from falling. Life had made her brisk, but not unkind. Being left by Lucas's father when the boy was 8 had carved suspicion into some of her trust, yet it had also sharpened her loyalty toward whatever remained. She noticed her son staring out the window and asked what he was looking for. Nothing, Lucas said, though that was not true. He was thinking of the tracks leading uphill, of the size of them, of the feeling that the animal making them had not been wandering but choosing. "Mr. Hale's up there alone," he added after a moment. Dana glanced toward the storm, then back at him. "Mr. Hale chose that," she said, but her tone held more uncertainty than judgment. Lucas did not answer. He had seen Tom from a distance enough times to know that solitude and peace were not always the same thing. Back in the cabin, the 4th pup nearly broke Tom's heart before it had fully begun beating in the world. The labor had grown harder by then. The mother's strength was thinning, each contraction wringing more from her than the last, and when the smallest pup arrived, it did so with a terrible stillness that made the room seem to stop around it. Tom stared once, then moved without allowing himself the luxury of fear. He cleared the membranes with quick, practiced fingers, rubbed the tiny body with a towel, leaned close, and listened for the sound that did not come. The pup was weaker than the others, smaller, pale at the chest and paws, its limbs slack, its mouth barely parted. Something old and brutal flashed through him then, not memory exactly, but the familiar sensation of refusing an outcome. "No," he said, and the word came out with startling force. He rubbed harder, careful but insistent, cupping the tiny body in both hands, as though friction could summon life where it had hesitated. He had done this once with a 19-year-old radio operator in Fallujah, palms pumping against a chest that felt too young to fail, voice steady over a storm of panic because panic never saved anybody. The boy had lived. Tom had not thought of him in years. The memory cut through him now, bright as a blade, but instead of freezing him, it focused him. He bent lower, breathed warmth toward the pup's face, rubbed again, and for one impossible second nothing changed. Then the tiny body twitched. A faint, sputtering sound followed, not even a cry at first, just a ragged claim to air, but it was enough. Tom felt something inside him crack open so quietly he might have mistaken it for relief, if relief had not hurt so much. The mother lifted her head, nosed the pup the moment he placed it beside her, and began to lick it with weary determination. Her eyes met Tom's once, and in them he saw not gratitude in any human sense, but recognition, the kind that passes between living things who understand that survival is rarely elegant and almost never solitary. Dawn came gray and slow. The storm had weakened into a fine, relentless fall by the time Clara's truck reached the lower bend of the ridge road. She parked where the snow deepened too much to trust the tires and walked the rest of the way, carrying the paper-wrapped bread against her chest to keep it warm. Her cheeks were pink from the cold by the time she reached the cabin porch, and there she paused, noticing first the dog tracks layered over by new snow, then a second set of smaller prints near the side window. Lucas stood partly hidden by the birch trees, his navy coat too thin for the weather, his solemn face fixed on the cabin as though it had become a story he needed to see with his own eyes. He looked embarrassed at being discovered, but Clara only gave him a small nod, the kind that neither scolds nor invites explanation. Tom opened the door a few inches when she knocked, then wider when he saw who stood there. He looked exhausted, rougher than usual, but there was something altered in his face, some hard line gone temporarily uncertain. Clara did not ask questions. She simply held out the bread and rolls. "Thought you might need breakfast," she said. Tom glanced past her and noticed Lucas by the trees. The boy lifted one hand awkwardly, then looked away. Tom followed Clara's gaze back into the cabin, where the shepherd now lay sleeping at last. Her body curved protectively around 4 newborn pups pressed against her belly like scraps of living night. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Tom stepped aside just enough for Clara to see better, and Lucas, from the window's edge, witnessed something he would remember for years. The mountain man everyone called distant and broken, kneeling on the floor with a towel in one hand, his expression gentler than the boy had ever imagined possible. Later, after Clara left the bread, and after Lucas slipped back down the slope, carrying that image with him like a secret, the cabin settled into a softer quiet. The mother had finished her work. The pups slept and rooted and squeaked in their blind, determined way. Tom sat on the floor beside the blanket, too tired to stand for a while, and after a long minute the shepherd shifted closer, rested the weight of her head against his thigh, and finally surrendered to sleep. The storm had passed, but winter did not leave with it. It simply settled deeper into the land, pressing its quiet weight across the mountains, softening edges, slowing time, and holding everything in a kind of suspended stillness that made each day feel both longer and thinner than the last. The cabin no longer felt like an empty structure clinging to the ridge. It had changed in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to ignore. There was movement now, small and constant. The restless shifting of newborn bodies against their mother's warmth. The faint squeaks that rose and fell like fragile threads of sound. The subtle presence of life that refused to remain unnoticed. Tom Hale had not planned for this. He had built his life carefully around absence, around the certainty that nothing would remain long enough to matter again, and yet each morning he found himself waking before the light reached the windows, not out of habit, but because something in the room required his attention. He fed the stove, checked the temperature of the air near the blanket, watched the mother as she cleaned and fed her pups with the tireless patience of instinct, and all the while he kept a distance that felt deliberate, necessary, as though allowing himself to care too much would invite something he was not prepared to survive again. The dog had grown stronger over the past 2 days. Her coat, though still rough in places, had begun to settle back into its natural shape, and the tension that had defined her body on that first night had eased into a quieter vigilance. Tom noticed the way she tracked his movements without appearing anxious, the way her ears shifted at small sounds, the way she positioned herself between him and the pups not out of distrust, but out of responsibility. She was not wild, not broken, but she was not entirely at ease either. There were moments when something in the outside world caught her attention, a distant engine, a shifting wind, and her body would stiffen in a way that spoke of memory rather than instinct. Tom recognized that, though he would not admit it out loud. He had learned long ago that the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. On the third morning, he found himself standing at the edge of the room, watching the small cluster of pups as they moved blindly against their mother's side, their tiny bodies pressing forward with a determination that seemed almost unreasonable for creatures so new to the world. He counted them without thinking. 4. The smallest one, the one he had nearly lost, was still weaker than the others, slower to latch, quieter in its movements, and Tom found himself checking on it more often than necessary, adjusting the blanket slightly, making sure it remained close to warmth. He did these things quickly, efficiently, as if they were tasks rather than choices, but each time his hand hovered there a fraction longer than it needed to. It bothered him, not the care itself, but the way it felt. Too familiar, too close to something he had already buried. Later that day, he made a decision that felt practical, even responsible. There were places in town that handled animals like this. Shelters, rescues. People who knew what they were doing, who had the resources to care for a mother and 4 pups without turning a quiet cabin into something else entirely. He told himself it was the right thing. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself many things that sounded reasonable when spoken inside his own head. He pulled on his coat, reached for the keys hanging by the door, and paused only long enough to glance back toward the blanket near the stove. The dog was awake, her head lifted, watching him. There was no alarm in her posture, no defensive movement, only that steady gaze again, the same one she had given him on the night she arrived, and something in it made the room feel smaller. Tom looked away first. Down in Pine Ridge, Clara Reed moved through her bakery with the same quiet rhythm she carried into everything she did, her hands steady as she kneaded dough on the worn wooden counter, her movements practiced but never mechanical. There was a kind of attention in the way she worked, a presence that suggested she was always somewhere deeper than the task itself, aware of things beyond the immediate moment. She had been thinking about the cabin since she left it the morning before. Not obsessively, not in a way that demanded answers, but with a gentle persistence that refused to fade. She remembered the way Tom had stood in the doorway, the guarded tension in his posture, and the way it had shifted, almost imperceptibly, when he looked at the dog and her pups. Clara had seen men like him before, men who carried silence like armor, who mistook distance for control, who believed that keeping the world out would somehow keep them safe from it. She did not judge him for it, she understood it too well. When the doorbell above the bakery entrance chimed softly, she looked up to see Lucas Bennett stepping inside, brushing snow from his sleeves with quick, distracted movements. He hovered near the door for a moment, unsure whether to approach, his eyes scanning the room as if he expected to find something different from what he had seen before. "You went up there," he said finally, his voice quiet but direct. Clara smiled faintly, not in amusement, but in recognition. "I did." Lucas shifted his weight, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. "The dog's real, then?" "Very real," Clara replied, wiping her hands on a cloth and stepping around the counter. "And the pups?" She nodded. Lucas absorbed that information in silence, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the direction of the mountain. "He's different," he said after a moment. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Mr. Hale?" Lucas nodded once. He didn't look like he wanted anyone around before, not even the dog. Clara considered that, her eyes softening slightly. Sometimes people don't know what they need until it arrives without asking. Lucas frowned, not entirely satisfied with the answer but unable to argue with it. "You think he'll keep them?" he asked. Clara did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the street where the snow had begun to fall again, lighter this time, more like a reminder than a threat. "I think," she said slowly, "that he's trying not to." Back at the cabin, Tom stood with his hand on the door handle again, the keys still in his other hand, his mind moving through the same argument it had been repeating for the past 10 minutes. It would be easier this way. Better for the dog, better for the pups, better for him. He opened the door, and the cold air slipped inside, not as violently as before, but enough to break the fragile warmth that had settled in the room. He stepped halfway out, his boots pressing into the thin layer of fresh snow on the porch, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine what it would feel like to drive down the mountain, to hand over the responsibility, to return to the life he understood. Behind him, there was a soft movement. Not loud, not urgent, but enough to draw his attention back inside. The dog had risen to her feet. Slowly, carefully, she crossed the small distance between the blanket and the door, her body still recovering, her steps measured. And when she reached him, she did not block his path, did not make any attempt to stop him in a physical sense. She simply looked up at him. It was the same look, not pleading, not demanding, just present. Her eyes held his in that quiet, unyielding way, and for a moment, the world outside the cabin seemed to fall away entirely. Tom stood there, caught between motion and stillness, between the version of himself he had been trying to maintain and something else that had begun to take shape without his permission. He thought of the way she had arrived, alone, carrying life through a storm that should have stopped her. He thought of the smallest pup, the one that had almost slipped away. He thought of the silence that had filled this cabin for so long, and the way it no longer felt quite the same. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and without fully acknowledging the decision as it formed, he stepped back inside. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. The keys remained in his hand for another moment before he set them down on the table, not with frustration, not with relief, but with a kind of quiet acceptance that did not need to be named. The dog held his gaze for 1 second longer, then turned, returning to the blanket where her pups waited, her body settling around them once more. Tom remained where he was for a moment, his hand resting against the door, his thoughts unusually still. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the road, the tracks, the world beyond the ridge. But inside, something had shifted again. Something small and irreversible. And for the first time since he had returned from a war he never truly left, Thomas Hale understood that staying might be the harder choice, and perhaps the only one that mattered. The days that followed did not bring peace so much as a quieter kind of tension, the sort that settled into the walls and floorboards of the cabin and made even the smallest sounds feel sharper, more deliberate, as if the world had begun to reveal something it had long kept hidden. The snow had eased into a steady rhythm, no longer violent, but persistent, covering the land in layers that softened the surface while burying what lay beneath, and Tom Hale found himself noticing things he might once have ignored. It began with the dog, as most things did now. He had started calling her nothing at all, avoiding names the way he avoided ownership, but the absence of a name did not prevent recognition, and each day he saw more clearly that she carried something deeper than simple exhaustion. When she moved, there was a slight hesitation in her back leg, not enough to slow her, but enough to suggest an old injury that had never fully healed. When the wind shifted in a certain direction, she would lift her head abruptly, her body going still in a way that spoke of memory, not curiosity. Her ears angled forward, her eyes fixed on something beyond the visible line of trees. And then there were the scars. Tom had noticed them before, but now he studied them with the same attention he once reserved for damage reports and field injuries. A thin, pale line ran along her flank, too straight to be the result of natural conflict. Another across the back of her shoulder where fur had grown in unevenly, and near her neck the faint indentation of pressure that had once been constant. A collar, yes, but not one worn freely. Something tighter, something that had held her in place. He crouched beside her one afternoon while the pups slept, his fingers hovering just above the marks without touching, tracing the history of them in his mind. "You didn't come from nowhere," he said quietly, though he did not expect an answer. The dog lifted her head, watching him, and for a moment he thought he saw something shift in her gaze, not fear, not exactly, but a recognition that whatever had been done to her was not entirely past. Tom leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. He had seen this before, too, not in animals, but in men who had returned from places where survival required endurance beyond reason. The body remembers. It always does. That same afternoon, Lucas Bennett stood at the edge of the forest again, his boots crunching softly against the snow as he followed a narrow path that wound between the birch trees. He had not told his mother he was coming up this way, not because he intended to hide anything, but because some part of him understood that what he was looking for could not be explained in simple terms. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the ground, the branches, the subtle shifts in the snow that might reveal something overlooked. Lucas had always been observant, but recently his attention had sharpened, drawn by the quiet mystery of the dog and the cabin, and the way both seemed connected to something larger than what he could see. He found it near a fallen log, half buried beneath a thin layer of snow that had not yet fully settled. At first, it looked like nothing more than a piece of twisted metal, but when he brushed the snow away with his glove, the shape became clearer. A loop of wire, rusted in places, bent into a crude circle with a tightening mechanism at one end. A snare. Lucas stared at it for a long moment, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand what he was looking at. He had seen pictures before in books or on television, but never this close, never in a place he knew. The wire was thin but strong, designed to tighten under pressure, to hold whatever passed through it. He imagined the dog, her leg caught, the struggle that must have followed, and something in his chest tightened in response. He did not touch it again. Instead, he stood slowly, his gaze moving outward, scanning the trees as if expecting to see something watching him from the shadows. There was nothing, only the quiet, the snow, the steady hush of winter. But the feeling remained. Back in Pine Ridge, Clara Reed wiped down the front counter of her bakery for the third time that morning, not because it needed cleaning, but because her hands preferred motion when her thoughts grew too still. She had been to the cabin twice more since that first visit, each time bringing something small, bread, soup, a jar of preserves, and each time she had stayed only as long as the moment required. She did not ask questions. She did not offer advice. She simply occupied the space without disturbing it, her presence calm, unintrusive, as if she understood that some things could not be rushed into clarity. Tom had not thanked her directly, but he had stopped closing the door as quickly when she arrived, and that was enough. On this particular morning, the bell above the door chimed again, and a man stepped inside, brushing snow from the shoulders of a heavy canvas jacket. He was new to her, or at least unfamiliar enough to draw attention. Tall, broad through the chest, with a beard that had grown unevenly along his jaw, streaked with early gray, and eyes that moved quickly, taking in the room with a kind of restless calculation. His name, she would learn later, was Daniel Crow, though most people called him Dan. There was something about him that felt unsettled, not dangerous in an obvious way, but not entirely at ease either. He ordered coffee, his voice low and rough, and stood near the window while it was poured, his gaze drifting towards the road that led up the mountain. Clara noticed the direction of that glance, the way it lingered a fraction longer than necessary, and though she said nothing, she filed the detail away. "Bad weather to be out," she remarked casually, sliding the cup across the counter. Dan gave a short nod, his mouth tightening slightly. "Weather's always bad up here," he replied, his tone flat. "Some people don't mind it." Clara held his gaze for a moment, her expression neutral. "Some people don't notice it," she said, then turned away before the conversation could settle into something heavier. By late afternoon, Tom had stepped outside the cabin, the air colder now that the wind had shifted again, carrying a sharper edge that hinted at more snow to come. He moved down the short path toward the tree line, following the instinct that had been growing quietly in him since he first noticed the scars. He did not expect to find anything, not really, but something in the pattern of events, in the way the dog reacted to certain sounds, to certain directions, suggested that whatever had happened to her was not as distant as he might prefer. He found the disturbed snow first, a subtle indentation near the edge of the trees, then another, and then the faint outline of something partially buried beneath a fresh layer. He crouched, brushing the snow aside with the back of his glove, and the wire loop revealed itself, similar to the one Lucas had found further down the slope. Tom stared at it, his expression hardening. This was not random. This was not old. The metal was too intact, the placement too deliberate. Someone had set these. Someone had been here. He stood slowly, his gaze lifting to the tree line, scanning the shadows where the forest thickened and light struggled to reach the ground. The quiet pressed in around him, heavier now, charged with the kind of awareness that had once kept him alive in places where hesitation meant death. Behind him, the dog had followed, her steps silent in the snow, and as she approached the edge of the path, her body went rigid, her ears lifted, her stance shifting from relaxed to alert in a fraction of a second, and a low sound rose in her throat, barely audible but unmistakable. Tom turned, watching her, then followed the direction of her gaze. At first, there was nothing, only trees, snow, the endless stillness of winter. Then, through a narrow break in the branches, he saw it. A vehicle, dark in color, parked at the far edge of the ridge road, partially obscured by the trees but close enough that it should not have gone unnoticed. It sat there without movement, engine off, no visible occupants, its presence out of place in a way that made the entire landscape feel suddenly smaller. Tom did not move. The dog remained beside him, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the same point. The two of them stood in silence, connected not by understanding, but by the shared recognition that something had shifted beyond the boundaries of the cabin, something that had followed the same path the dog once took, and had not yet decided to leave. The storm did not return with violence that night, but the air carried something sharper than cold, a tension that settled into the trees and held there like breath before a fall. And Tom Hale stood at the edge of his property with the quiet certainty that the world had shifted from chance to intent. The vehicle he had seen earlier remained where it had been, its dark frame partially hidden between trunks and drifting snow, not abandoned, not accidental, but placed with purpose, and that knowledge stirred something old in him, something he had spent years trying to leave buried beneath routine and distance. The shepherd stood beside him, her posture rigid, her ears forward, her entire body tuned to a frequency he could not hear but instinctively trusted, and when she gave a low, controlled growl that never rose into sound, Tom understood that whatever had touched her past had not remained there. He did not approach the vehicle. Not yet. He turned instead, guiding the dog back toward the cabin with a calm that was more practiced than natural, his steps deliberate, his senses wide, and once inside he secured the door, checked the windows, and moved through the space with the efficient precision of a man who had learned to prepare before asking questions. The pups slept, unaware, their small bodies pressed into warmth, their existence too new to understand the world they had entered, and Tom paused there a moment, looking at them longer than he intended before turning away. Down in Pine Ridge, Lucas Bennett did not wait for certainty. He had seen enough that afternoon. The wire, the broken branch patterns, the direction of the tracks, and though fear pressed at him in quiet, unfamiliar ways, something stronger had begun to form beneath it, a sense that doing nothing would be worse. He stood outside the sheriff's office, his hands clenched inside his sleeves, his breath visible in the cooling air, and after a long hesitation, he pushed the door open. Sheriff Walter Griggs looked up from behind a cluttered desk, his expression shifting from irritation to mild curiosity as he recognized the boy. Griggs was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, his hair a thinning gray that he kept trimmed short, his face lined in ways that suggested more years of routine than of crisis, though his eyes, a faded green, carried a patience that came from having seen trouble arrive slowly more often than suddenly. He was not a dramatic man, not the kind to chase danger for the sake of it, but he understood patterns, and he trusted what did not fit. "You're Dana's kid," he said, leaning back slightly. Lucas nodded, his voice quieter than usual, but steady. "There are traps in the woods," he said. Griggs studied him for a moment, not dismissing, not immediately believing, but listening. "What kind of traps?" Lucas stepped closer, describing the wire loop, the placement, the way it had been hidden but not forgotten, and as he spoke, the sheriff's expression shifted, the lines around his mouth tightening slightly. "You show me where?" Griggs asked. Lucas hesitated only briefly before nodding again. Back at the cabin, Clara Reed did not knock when she arrived. She had seen the vehicle on her way up the ridge, not clearly, not enough to identify, but enough to feel the same quiet disturbance she had learned never to ignore. She stepped onto the porch, her boots leaving soft impressions in the fresh snow, and opened the door without waiting, her presence calm, deliberate, as though she had already decided she belonged there for the moment. Tom turned at the sound, his posture tightening for a fraction of a second before he recognized her, and something in his expression shifted again, not relief exactly, but an easing of the tension that had settled into him since he first saw the car. "You saw it," he said, not as a question. Clara nodded once, removing her gloves slowly. "I did." She stepped further inside, her gaze moving across the room, noting the arrangement, the pups, the dog, and the subtle changes that had taken place since her last visit. "You're not leaving," she added, her tone neutral but certain. Tom let out a breath that almost resembled a dry laugh. "Doesn't look that way." Clara moved closer to the stove, crouching briefly to check the warmth near the blanket, her movements gentle, familiar, as if she had done this many times before in another life. "Good," she said simply, then stood, turning to face him fully. "Because I'm not either." Tom looked at her then, really looked, noticing the steadiness in her stance, the absence of hesitation, the way she occupied the space without asking permission. And for a moment he felt the faint echo of something he had not allowed himself in years. Trust. Not in outcome, but in presence. Outside, the sound of an engine cut through the quiet, low at first, then rising slightly as it moved along the ridge road, closer now, deliberate in its approach. Tom's body responded before his mind caught up, his attention sharpening, his focus narrowing, and he moved toward the window, positioning himself where he could see without being seen. The vehicle emerged from behind the line of trees, the same dark truck, its headlights off despite the fading light, its movement slow, almost cautious. It did not stop at the cabin. It passed, continuing down the road for a short distance before halting again, just out of direct view, as if reconsidering. The shepherd rose to her feet, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the direction of the sound, and the low growl returned, stronger this time, not uncontrolled, but unmistakably defensive. Clara stepped closer to Tom, not touching him, but near enough that their presence formed a quiet alignment rather than separate points of tension. "You know who that is," she said softly. Tom shook his head once, his gaze never leaving the window. Not yet. He did not reach for a weapon. Not because he was unprepared, but because something in him understood that escalation was not the first move here. He waited instead, watching, listening, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it into something it had not yet become. Minutes passed. The engine cut off, the silence returned, heavier now, layered with intention. Then, from the distance, another sound. Tires. A second vehicle, approaching from the lower road, faster, less cautious, and as it came into view, Tom recognized the sheriff's truck, its presence grounding in a way he had not expected. It slowed near the first vehicle, stopping at an angle that blocked its path, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then a figure stepped out from the dark truck. Tall, broad, his movements measured but edged with tension. Even at a distance, Tom recognized the shape. Daniel Crow. The sheriff stepped out next, his posture steady, his presence less imposing but no less firm. And though the words exchanged between them did not carry through the distance, the tone was clear enough in their body language. Not confrontation exactly, but not casual either. The exchange was brief. Crow gestured once, sharply, then turned back toward his truck, his movements tighter now, less controlled, and after a moment he climbed inside, the engine starting again with a low growl before the vehicle reversed slowly, then pulled away down the road, disappearing into the trees. The sheriff remained a moment longer, watching, then returned to his own truck and continued up the ridge, stopping briefly at the cabin before stepping out. Tom opened the door before he could knock. "You expecting company?" Griggs asked, his tone dry but not entirely without concern. Tom shook his head. "No." The sheriff glanced past him, taking in the dog, the pups, Clara standing quietly near the stove, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, but recognition that the situation had grown beyond something simple. "Boy came in," he said after a moment. "Said there were traps." Tom nodded once. "He's right." Griggs exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting back toward the road where the other truck had been. "I'll take care of it," he said, though his tone suggested the matter was not yet finished. Tom did not argue. He stepped back, allowing the door to close again, and for a long moment, the three of them stood in the quiet cabin, the tension easing not because the danger had vanished, but because it had shifted into something known, something that could be faced rather than imagined. Clara moved first, returning to the stove, adjusting the kettle as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and the simplicity of that action grounded the moment in a way Tom had not expected. He looked at her, then at the dog, then at the small cluster of life near the fire, and something in him settled, not completely, not permanently, but enough to change the shape of his next breath. There were people who left when things became complicated. He had been one of them once, in ways he did not like to examine too closely. But now, standing in a cabin that no longer belonged only to him, he understood something he had not been ready to accept before. Staying was not always about need. Sometimes it was a choice, and sometimes it was the only one that mattered. Winter did not loosen its grip on the mountain, but something within the cabin had begun to soften, as if the cold itself had lost a small measure of its authority over the lives it once held in stillness. And Thomas Hale moved through his days now with a rhythm that no longer felt empty. The work came first, though it no longer felt like something to pass the time. He repaired the loose boards along the outer wall with careful precision, replacing warped planks that had long been ignored, sealing cracks where the wind used to whisper its way inside, and reinforcing the roof where snow had begun to gather too heavily. His hands moved with the same discipline they had always known, but the purpose behind them had shifted. He was not maintaining a structure anymore. He was protecting something within it. Inside, the pups had grown stronger, their small bodies no longer fragile suggestions of life, but determined, squirming creatures that pushed against one another with surprising force, their eyes still closed but their presence undeniable. The smallest one, the one he had nearly lost, remained slower, quieter, but it held on with a stubborn persistence that Tom found himself respecting in a way he did not question. The mother watched everything. She moved with more confidence now, her strength returning in steady increments, her coat slowly regaining its natural depth beneath the layers of recovery, and though she still carried the marks of what she had endured, there was less tension in her stance, less of that constant readiness to react. She trusted the space now. Not entirely, perhaps not yet, but enough. Tom noticed that she no longer followed him with the same intensity when he stepped outside. Instead, she remained with the pups, her role clear, her focus unbroken. It was a kind of balance he understood. Clara Reed became part of that rhythm without ever announcing her place in it. She arrived when she chose, never at the same hour, never with expectation, carrying small things that made no demands in return. A thermos of tea, fresh bread. Once, a bundle of herbs tied with twine, their scent sharp and grounding as she hung them near the stove. She moved through the cabin with quiet familiarity, her presence steady but unobtrusive, as though she understood that the space itself was learning to hold more than one life at a time. They did not speak much, not in the way people often expected conversation to fill silence. Instead, they allowed it to exist between them, not as absence, but as something complete. One afternoon, as the light settled low against the windows and the wind carried only a faint reminder of its former strength, Clara stood beside Tom near the back wall of the cabin where he had begun reinforcing a support beam. She held a nail between her fingers, offering it without comment when his hand extended, and for a moment their movements aligned in a quiet coordination that required no instruction. "You've done this before," she said finally, her voice soft, not probing, simply observant. Tom drove the nail in with a measured strike, then another, his gaze fixed on the wood rather than her. "Different structures," he replied. Clara nodded, as if that answer contained everything it needed to. She did not ask about the places he had been, the things he had seen, the reasons behind the silence he carried. She had learned long ago that people revealed themselves not through explanation, but through the choices they made when no one required them to speak. Lucas Bennett began coming up the ridge more often now, though he never arrived unannounced in the way children sometimes do. He approached the cabin slowly, his steps measured, his presence tentative but consistent, and Tom had stopped pretending not to notice him before he reached the porch. The boy had changed in subtle ways. There was still that quiet watchfulness in his eyes, but it had softened at the edges, replaced by something steadier, something closer to belonging. One morning, he stood just outside the door, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his coat, his gaze fixed on the small window where he knew the pups were kept. Tom opened the door before he could knock. "You're going to stand there all day?" he asked, his tone neutral, but not unkind. Lucas hesitated, then shook his head, stepping inside with careful movements as if crossing a threshold that meant more than the physical act itself. He crouched near the blanket, his attention drawn immediately to the small cluster of movement, and for the first time since Tom had known him, a faint smile touched his expression, brief but real. "They're bigger," he said. Tom nodded once. "They tend to do that." Lucas reached out slowly, stopping just short of touching, waiting, and when the mother did not react with alarm, only a calm awareness. He allowed his fingers to rest lightly against the fur of the nearest pup. The contact was brief, almost reverent, and when he pulled back, something in his posture shifted, as if a space within him had been filled in a way he had not expected. Dana Bennett noticed the change in her son before she understood its source. He spoke a little more now, not much, but enough that the silence between them no longer felt as heavy. He asked questions about things beyond school, about work, about how people decided where they belonged, and though Dana did not always have answers, she recognized the difference. It worried her, in a distant way, the idea that he was forming attachments beyond the safety of their small home. But it also relieved something in her she had not realized was strained. Sheriff Walter Griggs kept his word. The traps were removed over the following days, each one found and dismantled with a patience that suggested he understood the importance of thoroughness over speed, and though he did not speak much about the man who had placed them, his presence along the ridge became more frequent, a quiet assurance that the boundary between safety and threat was being watched. Tom did not ask for details. He did not need them. What mattered was that the tension that had once pressed against the cabin had eased, not completely, but enough to allow something else to take its place. It happened without ceremony, without announcement, on a morning that felt no different from the others. The fire burned low, the light outside pale and steady, and Tom stood near the blanket, watching the mother as she shifted slightly to make room for the pups that had begun to move with more purpose, their small bodies no longer content to remain still. He had been thinking about it for days, though he had not admitted it, not even to himself. Names had a way of making things permanent, of turning presence into connection, and he had spent too long avoiding both. Clara stood near the table, pouring tea into 2 chipped cups, her movements unhurried, her gaze drifting toward him with a quiet awareness that suggested she already understood what he was considering. Tom exhaled slowly, his hand resting briefly against the back of the chair, and then, without ceremony, without explanation, he spoke. "Hope," he said. The word settled into the room with a weight that surprised him, not because of its sound, but because of what it carried. The dog lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment, and though she could not understand the meaning, she recognized the tone, the intention behind it. Clara did not react immediately. She set the second cup down, her fingers lingering against the rim for a moment before she looked at him, and when she did, there was a softness in her expression that did not need to be explained. She smiled, not wide, not overt, but in a way that suggested something had aligned exactly as it should. "That fits," she said quietly. Tom did not respond. He did not need to. The name remained, settling into the space, becoming part of the rhythm that had formed within the cabin, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to question it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, lighter now, almost gentle, and within the quiet of the mountain something had taken root, something that did not rely on words to exist, something that did not need to be explained to be understood. Spring did not arrive all at once in the mountains. It came in hesitant gestures and small breaks between storms, in the quiet dripping of melting snow from the edge of the cabin roof, in the way the light lingered a little longer against the trees each evening, and Thomas Hale stood on the porch one morning with a cup of coffee in his hand and realized that the world had begun to move forward without asking his permission, just as it always had. The air was still cold, but it no longer cut as sharply, and beneath the surface of the snow there was a subtle shift, a softening that suggested something beneath it was preparing to return. Inside the cabin, the pups had grown into restless, curious creatures, no longer confined to the blanket near the stove, but exploring the edges of the room with uncertain steps, their ears beginning to lift, their eyes now open and searching, taking in a world that was no longer defined only by warmth and instinct. Each of them had developed in their own way. The smallest one, the one Tom had fought to keep alive, remained quieter than the others, its movements more deliberate, its attention more focused, as if it had learned early that survival required patience. The largest pup, darker along the back, had become the boldest, often straying further than the others before realizing the distance and scrambling back toward the familiar scent of its mother. Hope watched them all with a calm vigilance, her body no longer marked by weakness but by quiet strength. Her movements smooth, her posture steady, the scars she carried still visible but no longer defining. Tom had stopped pretending that she was temporary. The name had settled into her presence, and with it, a kind of understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. He found himself speaking it sometimes without thinking, low and steady, the sound of it unfamiliar in his voice but no longer uncomfortable. "Hope," he would say, when she moved too far toward the door, or when one of the pups strayed too close to the cold floor, and each time her ears would shift slightly in response, her attention returning to him without hesitation. Clara Reed continued to come and go as she always had, her presence woven into the rhythm of the cabin so naturally that it no longer felt like an addition, but like something that had always been there. She brought fewer things now, not because they were not needed, but because the need itself had changed. Sometimes she came with nothing at all, only herself, her quiet awareness, her steady hands. She would sit near the window with a cup of tea, watching the pups as they explored, her expression thoughtful, not distant, but reflective in a way that suggested she was measuring something deeper than the moment. No one asked her how long she had been alone anymore. The question had faded, not because it had been answered, but because it no longer mattered. She existed in the present with a kind of completeness that made time irrelevant, and in that space she found something that neither demanded nor resisted connection. Tom understood that, though he would not have said it out loud. Lucas Bennett no longer stopped at the edge of the trees. He walked up the path with a quiet certainty now, his steps more confident, his presence less hesitant, as if the invisible line that had once separated him from the cabin had dissolved without needing to be crossed. He helped without being asked, carrying wood, checking the water, watching the pups with a kind of careful attention that bordered on responsibility. He laughed once, unexpectedly, when one of the pups stumbled over its own feet and rolled into the others, and the sound surprised all of them, including himself. Dana Bennett noticed it too. She had come up the ridge one afternoon, her coat pulled tight against the lingering cold, her expression cautious but open, and when she saw her son kneeling on the cabin floor, surrounded by movement and warmth, and something that resembled belonging, she felt a tension in her chest ease in a way she had not expected. She spoke with Tom briefly, her tone direct but not guarded, her words shaped by years of managing life without illusions, And though she did not stay long, she left with a quiet understanding that whatever had taken root in this place was not something she needed to protect him from. Sheriff Walter Griggs stopped by less often now, his presence no longer required in the same way, though he still checked the ridge when his rounds allowed it. The traps had not returned. The vehicle had not been seen again. Daniel Crow had left Pine Ridge without explanation, his absence as quiet as his arrival, and though no one spoke openly about it, the sense of unease that had once lingered in the background had begun to fade, replaced by something steadier, something less fragile. As the days lengthened, decisions began to take shape, not as burdens, but as natural extensions of what had already begun. The pups could not all remain. Tom knew this, accepted it, though the acceptance came with a weight he had not anticipated. Clara helped him arrange it, not through formal channels but through quiet connections, people she knew, families in town who understood the value of a good dog, who would treat them not as possessions, but as companions. One by one, the pups left the cabin, carried carefully down the mountain in arms that held them with a mixture of excitement and care. Lucas watched each departure with a seriousness that made him seem older than he was, his gaze following until the last moment, as if committing each one to memory. The smallest pup was the last to go. The family that took it lived at the far end of Pine Ridge, a couple in their 60s who had lost their own dog the previous winter and had not expected to open their home again. The man, Robert Ellis, was tall and lean, his shoulders slightly stooped from years of carpentry, his hands rough but gentle, his hair white and thin along the edges, and his wife, Margaret Ellis, was a quiet woman with soft gray eyes and a warmth that did not need to be spoken. When she held the pup, she did so with a tenderness that needed no explanation, and Tom found that he did not hesitate when he placed it in her arms. "He'll be all right," Robert said, not as a promise, but as a simple truth. Tom nodded once. "Yeah," he replied, "he will." When they left, the cabin felt different again. Not empty, but quieter. The movement reduced. The space expanded in ways that reminded him of what it had once been, but without the same sense of absence. Hope remained. She lay near the door that evening, her body relaxed, her gaze following Tom as he stepped outside, her presence steady, certain, as if she had always known this was where she would stay. Clara stood near the edge of the porch, her hands resting lightly against the railing, her eyes on the horizon where the last of the snow was beginning to recede, revealing the dark earth beneath. Tom joined her after a moment, his posture easy in a way that would have seemed impossible not long ago. They did not speak. They did not need to. Lucas sat on the steps below, his arms wrapped loosely around his knees, his gaze moving between them and the open land beyond, no longer apart, no longer watching from a distance, but present, fully, without reservation. The wind moved through the trees, softer now, carrying with it the first real hint of warmth, and for a moment everything seemed to settle into place. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Tom looked down at Hope, who had come to stand beside him, her body close but not pressing, her presence a quiet constant, and he rested his hand briefly against her head, the gesture simple, unguarded. Clara glanced at him then, her expression unchanged but knowing, as if she had understood this moment long before it arrived. The world did not return what had been lost. It never did. But as Tom stood there with the mountain stretching out before him, with the remnants of winter giving way to something new, with the presence of those who had chosen to remain, he realized that what stayed carried its own kind of weight, its own kind of grace. Not everything had come back, but enough had remained, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive as light from the sky or voices in the wind. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a lost soul finding its way to your door, or a wounded heart choosing to open just one more time. Perhaps God does not always change our lives in a single moment, but places something gentle in our path, something that asks us to care, to stay, to believe again. In our everyday lives, we may overlook these moments, thinking they are small, ordinary, or accidental. But what if they are not? What if they are answers to prayers we no longer remember making? If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment to tell us what you believe miracles look like in your life, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you stories that remind us we are never truly alone. May God watch over you, guide your steps, and bring peace and warmth into your life, just when you need it most.